Welcome to the History of European Theatre podcast, and thanks for joining me on this journey through millennia of theatrical history. Episode 151, A Midsummer Night's Dream. Man is but an ass if he go about to expound this dream. Having finished with Ben Jonson's biography, we can now go back in time just a little to work through Shakespeare's and Jonson's plays in more detail. You will remember that I've already discussed the early Shakespeare plays, the Henry VI trilogy, Richard III, The Taming of the Shrew, Titus Andronicus, Two Gentlemen of Verona, and The Comedy of Errors. In the timeline, that took us to, let's say, the early 1590s, more or less. As you will also remember, the precise dating of Shakespeare's plays, where we don't have any datable contemporary accounts of performances or early printed editions, is more of an art than a science. By the early 1590s, Shakespeare, then about 30 years old, was certainly in his stride, having proven his talents as history plays, comedies, and something close to tragedy in Titus Andronicus and Richard III. Ben Jonson was almost a decade younger than Shakespeare, and it would be towards the end of the 1590s when he found his first big success. William Shakespeare was then the man of the theatrical moment, no longer the young upstart, but the proven playmaker, and A Midsummer Night's Dream surely did nothing but enhance that reputation, and it has been popular ever since. As it is such a well-known play, there's a good chance that you've seen it, and maybe more than once, so I'm just going to give a very brief synopsis of the play here. If you need a more detailed synopsis, you can easily find some online. Take a pause and I'll still be here when you get back. As the play opens, Duke Theseus of Athens is preparing for his marriage to Hippolyta, Queen of the Amazons. He's asked to intervene in the case of Hermia, who is refusing to marry the husband chosen for her, Demetrius. The Duke orders her to accept him, or die, or go to a convent. Upset, Hermia elopes to the forest with Lysander, her true love, with the help of her friend Helena, who is in love with Demetrius. All four young Athenians end up lost in the woods. And meanwhile, a group of amateur actors prepare a play, the tragic love story of Pyramus and Thisbe, to present before the Duke on his wedding day. Nearby, Oberon, the king of the fairies, has recently quarrelled with his queen Titania. She acquired a magical child, and she now refuses to hand him over to Oberon to use as a page. Oberon begins to plot revenge on her for her disobedience. He sends his fairy servant, Puck, to fetch a purple flower with juice that makes people fall in love with the next creature that they see. Oberon hears Helena and Demetrius arguing in the forest and sees how Demetrius mistreats Helena, so he tells Puck to use the love potion so that Demetrius will fall in love with the first person that he sees. But Puck gives Lysander the potion by mistake, and when he wakes and sees Helena, he immediately falls in love with her. While Demetrius rests, Oberon puts the potion in his eyes, which makes him fall in love with Helena as well. The workers' rehearsals in the woods are overheard by Puck, who plays a trick on them by giving Nick Bottom an ass's head. After frightening the others away, Bottom is lured to the sleeping Titania, whom Oberon has administered the love potion to. On waking, she falls in love with Bottom as an ass and entertains him with her fairy court. Meanwhile, Demetrius and Lysander pursue Helena, making Hermia jealous. Oberon and Puck watch the chaos until Oberon commands Puck to put everything right again. The lovers are weary, and Puck tricks them further into the forest until they fall asleep, at which point Puck reverses the potion for Lysander. After being pampered by Titania's fairies, Bottom falls asleep. Oberon restores Titania and wakes her. After expressing her dismay at the sight of Bottom, she reconciles with Oberon. Bottom's ass's head is removed, and he returns to the city to rejoin his friends as they prepare to perform the play. The lovers in the forest are woken by Theseus and Hippolyta, who are out on a hunting party. Lysander sees Hermia and falls in love with her again. Happily reunited to their correct pairings, that is, Lysander with Hermia and Demetrius with Helena, they agree to also wed on the Duke's wedding day. The play, Pyramus and Thisbe, is presented before the wedding guests, who find the performance very amusing, seemingly not realising how it reflects their recent experiences. As the three couples retire to bed, Puck and the fairies return to bless the palace and the guests. A Midsummer Night's Dream is thought to have been written in 1595 or early 1596, meaning that its first performances would have been played at the theatre, where still some 3 years before the construction of the Globe from the remains of the deconstructed theatre. That dating is based on some topical allusions in the play, the most notable of which is an apparent reference to a poem by Edmund Spenser written for his wife on their wedding day in 1594, and which was published in 1595. There's also what is taken to be praise for Queen Elizabeth in Oberon's line, "At the fair vestal throned by the west," placing the play very much in her lifetime. There's also a reference to floods that led to drenched fields and crop failures which blighted England from 1594 to 1597, when Titania says to Oberon, "These are forgeries of jealousy, and never since the middle summer's spring met we on a hill, in dale, forest or mead, by paved fountain or by rushy brook, or in the breach-head margent of the sea, to dance our ringlets to the wishing wind, but with thy brawls thou hast disturbed our sport. Therefore the winds piping to us in vain, as if in revenge, have sucked up from the sea contagious fogs, which falling in the land hath every pelting river made so proud, that they have overborne their countenance. The ox hath therefore stretched his yoke in vain, the ploughman lost his sweat, and the green corn hath rotted ere his youth attended a beard. The fold stands empty in the drowned field, and cows are fatted with the murrain flock. The 9 men's morris is filled up with mud, and the quaint mazes in the wanton green, for lack of tread, are undistinguishable. The human mortals want their winter here. No night is now with hymn or carol blessed. Therefore the moon, the governess of floods, pale in her anger washes all the air, that rheumatic diseases do abound. And throughout this distemperature we see the seasons alter. Hoary-headed frosts fall in the fresh lap of the crimson rose, and on old Hyme's thin and icy crown an odorous chaplet of sweet summer buds is, as in mockery, set. The spring, the summer, the chiding autumn, angry winter, change their wonted liveries, and the mazed world by their increase now knows not what is which. And this same progeny of evils come from our debate, from our dissension. We are their parents and original. I quoted that passage from Scene 1, Act 2 in full because it is, I think, particularly striking in a dramatic sense. It comes after the overtly comic scenes where the amateur theatricals are discussed by Quince, Bottom and the other rude mechanicals, and before the love potions are erroneously administered, and it darkens the tone with its emphasis on the tensions between Titania and Oberon. Reminding people about natural phenomena that has caused extended problems with the food supply seems a brave addition to a comedy on the part of the dramatist, and, of course, it also shows how passages written 400 years ago can still sound eerily modern in their concern for changes in the climate. Aside from these allusions, the best documentary evidence for the dating of the play is that it is one of the 6 comedies listed by Francis Mears in his 1598 book that makes Shakespeare, in his estimation, one of our best for comedies. So, depending on the accuracy of that 1595 or 1596 date, the play sits chronologically alongside Romeo and Juliet, King John, The Merchant of Venice and Richard II, which gives a sense of the diversity of the subject and style that Shakespeare was already able to command. The only date we can be sure about is the first documented performance of the play, which was at Hampton Court as part of the Christmas celebrations on the 1st of January 1604. Given the setting and themes of the play, it has been suggested that it was written for an aristocratic wedding celebration, the most likely candidate being the wedding of Thomas Berkeley, the soon-to-be 7th Baron Berkeley, to Elizabeth Carey, daughter to Baron Hudson and the godchild of the Queen, in February 1596. Another possibility is the wedding of William Stanley, the 6th Earl of Derby, who married Elizabeth de Vere, daughter of Edward de Vere, the 17th Earl of Oxford, in January 1595. Yet another alternative suggestion is that the play was written for the Queen as part of the celebrations for the feast day of St. John, a Christian feast day that fell on or near Midsummer's Day. That being said, I should point out that there is no definitive evidence for any of these ideas. There's no direct original source for the play, but Shakespeare seems to have taken inspiration from Chaucer's The Knight's Tale from the Canterbury Tales. Evidently, this was one of his favourite pieces of Chaucer, as he returned to it several years down the line as a source for Two Noble Kinsmen. There are also elements borrowed from another favourite source, Ovid's Metamorphoses. Other suggestions for inspiration go as far as Aristophanes' The Birds and a German poem from the 15th century, which was in circulation in print by the 1590s in London. A very tempting idea is that the quarrel over the beautiful Helena is an allusion to the Trojan War as described by Homer in the Iliad, therefore putting Shakespeare as knowledgeable and an appreciator of that text. For some scholars, the influence of Spenser's Faerie Queene, a work published in 1590, looms large in A Midsummer Night's Dream. The mixing of different folklore traditions was something significantly first undertaken by Spenser, and perhaps Shakespeare took Spenser's Faerie Queene character, designed to praise Elizabeth, and morphed it into Titania as a comic parody of the original. Although I've mentioned the influence of the Bible on Shakespeare before, I think it's always worth reminding ourselves that references to and quotations from the Bible pepper all of Shakespeare's work, and A Midsummer Night's Dream is no exception. Several passages directly quote the Bible, and in some cases misquote it for comic effect. As an example, in Bottom's dream speech, he misquotes Paul's first letter to the Corinthians. The original, from the Bishop's Bible, which was first published in 1568, so current and familiar to all at the time that A Midsummer Night's Dream was written, is, "The eye hath not seen, and the ear hath not heard, neither have entered into the heart of man the things which God hath prepared for them." And Bottom's misquote is, "The eye of man hath not heard, the ear of man hath not seen, man's hand is unable to taste, his tongue to conceive, nor his heart to report what my dream was." Which is a significant adaptation of the biblical verse, but close enough to be recognised by most of the audience as incorrect. As I've mentioned before, at the time, most people were very familiar with Bible passages, if not from the frequent church services which included lengthy sermons that expounded on particular biblical verses, then from the rote learning of passages as part of the education process. Shakespeare pitched this perfectly, I think, so that the reference would be recognised, but is different enough to be appropriate for the fantastical dream sequence that Bottom has just experienced at that point in the play. It is also highly likely, although not provable, that Shakespeare made use of current folklore tales published as poems or broadsheets containing familiar stories and ideas that were in the zeitgeist and that he could therefore tap into. The play doesn't appear in the Stationers' Register until 1600, when a quarto edition was published. In that edition, the title page states, "As it hath been sundry times publicly acted by the Right Honourable the Lord Chamberlain his servants," written by William Shakespeare. There was a further quarto printing in 1619, and then the play next appears in the first folio. A Midsummer Night's Dream is primarily an extended riff on love, its effects, how it affects, and what it is to be loved and to be in love. But it does also have a twisted, slightly darker side that for a modern audience might throw up questions about consent. By misapplying the love potions and thereby controlling desires and emotions in an abnormal way, the fairies make a mockery of true love. Even Queen Titania falls in love with an ass, no longer in control of her own passions. The quartet of human lovers fare no better, meeting nothing but problems when they flee to the forest, thanks to the intervention of the fairies, all of which played into accepted notions that the woodland was a place of danger and strange behaviours that were outside of the norms of society. That darkness can also be detected in the framing of the play in the marriage of Hippolyta and Theseus. Although the play ends with them apparently happily married, Hippolyta is a prize of war, however accepting of her fate she appears to be. As they watch the play within the play of Pyramus and Thisbe, they are not the typical image of romantic love and desire that, on the surface, the play appears to explore. Some productions, and you may have seen the BBC adaptation from 2023 as a strong example of this, play on the idea that Hippolyta is far from a willing party to the marriage plan, and the relationship is not only loveless but antagonistic. In fact, that BBC adaptation takes that point to the extreme and has a twist that is a very particular interpretation of the play. Theseus, the great Athenian warrior king, and Hippolyta, the Amazon queen, place the play in ancient Greece. But that setting is really of very little relevance to the play. The setting is distant in place and time, very deep time, and therefore, to all intents and purposes, no particular time at all. As with many, if not all the comedies, the characters believe that they are behaving rationally, while we as an audience enjoy their misdirection and stupidity. In this play, we can see their inability to see the irrationality of their actions as a result of desire and passion, albeit induced by magic and love potions. As the love triangle at the centre of the play shifts on its axis, the question is raised as to what is the nature of attraction, when it is apparently interchangeable. And again, the BBC adaptation takes this aspect to another level. Even without adaptation, that question of the nature of attraction is taken to the extreme as events between the Fairy Queen and the Weaver, transformed with the head of an ass, unfold. This Beauty and the Beast story is all a comic mix-up. But that doesn't stop Bottom and Titania believing that their desires are very real while they're under the influence of the potions. And reality hits home with the very amateurish performance of Pyramus and Thisbe being staged by the guildsmen for the wedding of Theseus and Hippolyta. Pyramus and Thisbe is a love story, so we might think appropriate for the wedding, but it ends with a tragic double suicide. The comedy of the performance means all the onstage audience laugh at the action. But once again, we are being reminded of just how far actions driven by desire can go. But certainly, the play is not just about desire, but it's about love too, or at least about romantic love in all its forms, which can be ridiculous and a long way from rational. It can also be visionary, and, the word can't be avoided, it can be dreamlike, and it can fail. With Bottom as the least likely romantic lead in Pyramus and Thisbe, we are not seeing a perfect vision of romantic love. But the play does suggest love can work in different circumstances, and mean different things for different pairings. In our modern view, we might call it inclusive. Lysander and Hermia are perhaps the most traditional version of romantic lovers. They speak the traditional language of love in exchanges like this one when they first meet in the forest. Lysander says, "How now, my love? Why is your cheek so pale? How chance the roses there do fade so fast?" To which Hermia replies, "Belike for want of rain, which I could well between them from the tempest of mine eyes." Hermia, having been told that she must marry unhappily, die, or go to a convent, is, not surprisingly, close to tears. But the image of thirsty roses in her cheeks about to be watered by her tears is both lyrical and romantic, pushing the threat of violence from the mind of the characters and the audience. The speech for all four lovers is the language of love, based on their reading of romantic tales and poetry, not from the experience of life. The effect is to make them somewhat indistinguishable as characters, not a charge often levelled at Shakespeare, but in this case it is, I think, quite intentional. Of all the characters, the lovers collectively represent the idealised world of romantic love. The play of Pyramus and Thisbe, the play within the play, is of particular interest for several reasons. Firstly, it mirrors the play as a whole, symbolically and literally. Both plays deal with the irrationality of love, the madness it induces, and the very fine line between imagination and reality. Extrapolated out to real life, that asks the question as to whether or not there is a force greater than the actions of people that can alter lives, as has happened in the play. The play within the play becomes chaotic, and instead of a tragedy, it becomes a lamentable comedy, a parody of theatre practice at the time. And to jump to the end of the play just for a moment, in the closing speech, Puck argues that everything the audience has just experienced was only a dream, emphasising that idea and perhaps undermining any application of serious themes to the play, depending on how you look at it. One thing we can say for sure is that the differences between the world of the mechanicals, the court, and the forest fade as the story evolves, and those worlds start to interact with each other. That applies to the rude mechanicals as well as to the plot of their lamentable comedy, the play within the play. So we have levels within levels of different realities which, in their own way, comment on the other worlds, the worlds of the fairies, the mechanicals, and the world of the Athenians. And those rude mechanicals of A Midsummer Night's Dream are some of the most well-known characters in Shakespeare's canon, and that term perhaps needs a bit of an explanation. Rude mechanical simply means a peasant craftsman, or perhaps a peasant artisan. Employing amateur actors to entertain a ruler and his consort on their wedding day may seem a little odd to us, used as we are to the highly professionalised theatre, but this is calling back to the traditions of the medieval period, where responsibility for the cycle or mystery plays was divided amongst the trade guilds. There is plenty of detail all about how that worked in Season 3 of the podcast, if you want to hear more about that. Even in the Elizabethan period, when secular theatre had taken prime position in the world of entertainment, religious plays were still performed at times, and players were more often than not guildsmen before they were actors. Shakespeare the glover, Armin the goldsmith, Hemming the grocer, and the Burbage family of carpenters are just a few examples. So the concept of the amateur player struggling to find a rehearsal space and having to deal with the egos and skills, or lack of skills, of an assembled troupe would not be an unusual concept for the audience. And with just a little stretch, we can accept the commission to perform at the wedding of a duke. The mechanicals are craftsmen with names that both hint at their profession and can have more bawdy interpretations. For example, it is suggested that Peter Quince's surname could derive from quines or coins, which relate to the work of a carpenter, but it would also have been understood as a reference to a sex worker or a generally promiscuous person. Francis Flute is a name suggestive of the bellows mending trade, where Francis would have repaired wheezy bellows, as is his high-pitched voice. He appropriately takes the female part, but flute is a bawdy reference to his masculinity, contrasting with his given role. These characters are easily looked down upon, as shown by the responses of the young lovers and Theseus and Hippolyta towards the mechanical's performance. The play within the play is called The Most Lamentable Tragedy and Most Cruel Death of Pyramus and Thisbe, with a plot that contains many similarities with Romeo and Juliet. But instead of a tragedy, the play turns into a comedy because of the terrible acting of the mechanicals. The on-stage audience, however, do not seem to realise the parallels with their own lives, whereas the audience in the playhouse certainly should. Then, the play within the play also tells us something about how theatre worked at the time. It is a view that we have to treat carefully, of course, as this is being done for theatrical and comic effect. Nevertheless, there are some interesting conclusions to be drawn when supported by other historical evidence. Philostrate parallels the master of the roles as he chooses which performance he wants to see at court and decides to shortlist the mechanicals. The rehearsal of the play also mimics the style of playing at the time, and the cue sheet method of actors only learning their lines from written out scripts that include only their lines and the immediate cue for that line. Snug is encouraged to extemporise his lines as the lion, but concerned that he might be frightening people too much with his roaring, he is given more lines that he speaks very well. The problems that Peter Quince, as director of the play, has to deal with would still be familiar to some amateur groups today, and possibly to some semi-professional or low-budget companies as well. The biggest challenges to face Peter Quince are with his actors. When Flute realises he will be playing a woman, which is of course a comic reference to the traditions of the time, he is not keen. "Nay, faith, let not me play a woman, I have a beard coming." And all of this, from their individual names, their professions, and their performing abilities, give the mechanicals a depth of character that means they are memorable for us as people of the historical period, or for Shakespeare's contemporary audience as people they recognise from life. By contrast, think of the undefined and unnamed characters of the actors performing in The Murder of Gonzalo in Hamlet, in a similar but far more deadly play within a play situation. There are multiple scenes in the play where the mechanicals are practising their lines, which already shows something of the character of the players. In the scene where we first meet the group, Quince reads out which mechanical will play which character in their play. Nick Bottom gets the role of Pyramus, but he wants more. He suggests he should also play Thisbe and the lion. Although doubling roles was common for actors at the time, and to some extent at least it was used by the playwrights as a means to compare and contrast different characters played by the same actor, Bottom's request is clearly a step too far. The characters Thisbe and Pyramus interact with each other on stage, even though there is a wall between them. But why does Bottom want to play multiple roles? In addition to the comedy of the over-ambitious actor, arguably this is making a point about control. Bottom wants to play all parts because he wants to be in control of the course of the play. But perhaps it is also just making a joke about bad amateur actors who have ideas above their station. A few lines later, Quince keeps Bottom from playing all the roles, and Bottom starts to recite lines about Hercules, as a response, saying, "I could play Hercules rarely, or a part to tear a cat in." Bottom's reference to Hercules is maybe to convey strength and leadership to his companions, but Quince will not be moved. So, after having decided who plays who, Quince ends the meeting and sends the actors off to meet later for rehearsal. The fact that Bottom wants to increase his power over all the others says something about his character, and perhaps also has a symbolic meaning. Bottom, who wants to control and order the play and the players, will soon be completely out of control with his head turned into an ass's head, and all because Robin wants to punish him for his foolish and overconfident behaviour. Bottom's attempts to control his life and the life of others couldn't go more wrong. In A Midsummer Night's Dream, the play within the play is very much part of the comedy, even though Pyramus and Thisbe is in fact a tragedy. It is a contrast with the play as a whole that exemplifies the fundamental difference between comedy and tragedy. There are moments when the play does turn towards tragedy, as when Hermia thinks that Lysander has been killed, but instead of stabbing herself to death, which would mirror the play within the play, the two lovers reunite. In tragedy, the established problem expounded in the play becomes a dilemma which drives to an inevitable solution that is catastrophic. In a comedy, a solution to the dilemma, however unlikely, is simply accepted and becomes the ending of the play. The play within a play is a tragedy when no solution is acceptable, so both Pyramus and Thisbe die. In the play as a whole, the elements that could lead to tragedy are solved by an acceptable ending, making A Midsummer Night's Dream a comedy. And for a theatre-literate audience, the rude mechanicals emphasise this through the play within the play. Pyramus and Thisbe is also often seen as a mirror of the play in general, arguably more so than any other plays by Shakespeare that contain a play within the play. The relationship of Pyramus and Thisbe is similar to that of Hermia and Lysander. Both the couples run off to the woods. They try to escape the fate that awaits them when the world finds out about their relationship. And Hermia and Lysander and Pyramus and Thisbe engage in a relationship that is disapproved of by their parents. In both couples, one partner experiences the loss of a lover to death, or at least they can envisage what that would be like when Pyramus thinks Thisbe has been killed by a lion and Hermia thinks Lysander has been murdered. We might say that all the paired lovers, in the madness and irrationality of their love, cannot see the truth of the barriers that have affected them. They laugh at the ridiculous wall that keeps Pyramus and Thisbe apart, but at least those tragic lovers can see what separates them. In both plays, as Bottom puts it, the course of true love never did run smooth. A Midsummer Night's Dream has remained one of the most popular plays in the canon ever since its first performance. Even through the closures of the theatres from 1642 to 1660, the play was remembered in the adaptation of the rude mechanical subplot into a sort of skit performed by acrobats, which managed to bypass the theatrical ban. At the Restoration, the play soon re-entered the repertoire, but not everybody enjoyed it. Samuel Pepys saw it in September 1662 and recorded it in his famous diary as "the most insipid, ridiculous play I ever saw." In his defence, it was a heavily adapted version that he was seeing, as was the trend at the time. The adapted versions continued until the 1840s, but original elements of the play continued to be remembered as inspiration for operas and masques. After its revival in the Victorian period, where it was played with added music and songs, it continued to be performed either as the original play or with dance and music added. Frequent revivals have continued right up to today, and it is a particular favourite with open-air theatres and summer productions for obvious reasons. As this episode is released in January 2025, the Royal Shakespeare Company are just about to close out a London run of the play. It will, no doubt, continue to live on. And I must mention that in putting this episode together, I am indebted to Rachel Anstad's illustrated encyclopedia and handbook on the play. There is so much that can be said about A Midsummer Night's Dream that I have only been able to pick out certain points that particularly appealed to me. But fortunately, Rachel has agreed to come back onto the podcast following our discussion about Twelfth Night and Twelfth Night traditions to talk about A Midsummer Night's Dream. So, next time, we will stay in the enchanted Athenian forest for more on this exuberant play. In the meantime, please join the Facebook page or group or find the podcast on Instagram or X to keep up to date with new episodes and other theatre-related things. There's also a new Blue Sky account for the podcast if X is no longer your thing, so please give the account there a follow and say hi. If you do feel able to help with the costs of running the podcast, then please head over to Patreon, where you will find additional content for a small monthly fee or a one-off donation. You can also make a one-off show of support through Ko-fi.com. I look forward to your company next time, but if you do have any comments or concerns in the meantime, you can also contact me by email at thoetp@gmail.com or through the website, where you can leave me a voice message by clicking on the microphone icon, or you can write to me on the contact page. That's all at www.thehistoryofeuropeantheatre.com.